this episode, I thought I would have a conversation with Chat GPT about cannabis. I wanted to ask some specific questions like why is cannabis illegal in the United States? Where does the government get its authority to criminalize cannabis? How does it compare to alcohol? And if states have medical marijuana programs, how can the federal government still list cannabis as a Schedule I drug? It's a very smart system. We kind of went back and forth with some of these questions, so I really think you're going to enjoy it. Okay, here we go. The first question I asked is, why is marijuana illegal in the United States? Here's what it said. Marijuana was made illegal in the United States in the 1930s due to a combination of factors including racial prejudice, fear-mongering, and political pressure. At the time, there was a growing sentiment that marijuana use led to insanity, violence, and moral decay. This view was fueled by media sensationalism, political rhetoric, and the testimony of government officials who claimed that marijuana was a dangerous drug. In 1937, the U.S. government passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which effectively made marijuana illegal by imposing strict regulations and taxes on its production, distribution, and sale. The act was pushed by Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who believed that marijuana was a threat to public health and safety. Since then, the prohibition of marijuana has been upheld by a combination of law enforcement efforts, public policy, and cultural attitudes. However, in recent years, there has been a growing movement to legalize marijuana for medical and recreational use, and several states have passed laws to that effect. Okay, so I'm setting it up here for some of the next questions that we're going to ask. So the next question I ask it is cannabis more harmful than alcohol? Okay, here's what it said. The relative harms of cannabis and alcohol are a subject of ongoing debate and research. Both substances can have harmful effects on physical and mental health, and the extent of those harms can vary depending on factors such as dosage, frequency of use, and individual susceptibility. In terms of acute effects, alcohol is known to impair judgment, coordination, and reaction time, which can increase the risk of accidents and injuries. In high doses, alcohol can also lead to alcohol poisoning, which can be fatal. Cannabis, on the other hand, can impair short-term memory, attention, and motor skills, which can also increase the risk of accidents and injuries. In rare cases, high doses of cannabis can lead to psychotic episodes or other adverse mental health outcomes. In terms of long-term effects, both substances can have harmful effects on physical health, such as liver damage from alcohol or respiratory problems from smoking cannabis. Cannabis use has also been associated with an increased risk of mental health problems such as depression and anxiety, particularly among heavy users or those with a history of mental illness. Alcohol use has been linked to a range of physical and mental health problems, including liver disease, cancer, and addiction. Overall, it is difficult to make a direct comparison between the harms of cannabis and alcohol, as the risks and consequences of use can vary widely depending on the individual and the circumstances. It is important for individuals to be informed about the potential risks and to make informed decisions about their substance use. So even though it's admitting alcohol is far more harmful than cannabis, it's still lumping them both together even after the question I asked which one is more harmful. So let's keep going. How many people have died from cannabis use, smoking, or eating it? All right, let's see how it responded. There is no evidence to suggest that anyone has died directly from a toxic overdose of cannabis, either from smoking or eating it. Unlike many other drugs, cannabis has a very low toxicity profile, and it is virtually impossible to consume a lethal dose. That being said, cannabis use can have indirect health risks and can contribute to accidents or other risky behaviors that can lead to injury or death. For example, cannabis use can impair judgment and coordination, which can increase the risk of accidents while driving or operating machinery. Cannabis use also can worsen underlying mental health conditions or trigger psychotic episodes, which can increase the risk of self-harm or suicide. It is also worth noting that smoking cannabis, like smoking tobacco, can have negative effects on respiratory health and may increase the risk of lung cancer and other lung diseases. However, it is difficult to attribute these risks solely to cannabis use, as many cannabis users also smoke tobacco or are exposed to other environmental factors that can contribute to lung damage. Overall, while cannabis use may have some indirect health risks and potential negative consequences, there is no evidence to suggest that anyone has died directly from consuming cannabis in its various forms. Boom. So even the AI model knows cannabis is basically harmless. You can't OD on it, and the government is still criminalizing it at a federal level. So let's keep going. Why doesn't the United States treat cannabis as a medicine on a federal level? Figured that would be a good question to ask it. Let's see how it responded. The United States federal government classifies cannabis as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act, which it is considered to have no medical value and a high potential for abuse. No medical value. This classification makes it difficult for researchers to study the potential medical benefits of cannabis and for patients to access cannabis-based treatments, as it is illegal at the federal level. There are several factors that have contributed to the federal government's reluctance to reclassify cannabis as a medicine. One of the main reasons is the lack of high-quality research on the medicinal benefits and risks of cannabis. Due to the federal classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug, researchers face significant obstacles in obtaining funding and approval to study its potential medical uses. Additionally, there are concerns about the potential for abuse and diversion of cannabis-based treatments if they were to be made more widely available. There are also concerns about the variability and purity of cannabis products, as well as the potential for negative side effects, particularly in vulnerable populations such as children and pregnant women. Oh, they care so much. Despite these challenges, there is growing recognition among healthcare providers and policymakers that cannabis-based treatments may have potential benefits for certain medical conditions such as chronic pain, nausea, and seizures. Several states have already legalized medical cannabis, and there are ongoing efforts to remove federal barriers to research and access to cannabis-based treatments. It just keeps proving that the federal government, the system, the way it's designed, is not there to help you or benefit you in any way. It's only to control you. Let's keep going. Why are there states with legal cannabis, but the federal government still has cannabis listed as a Schedule I drug? Now, this is a little redundant. Did ask something similar earlier, but I'm trying to catch it and kind of put it in a box, see if it'll give me some different answers. So let's see what it says. There are currently 36 states and the District of Columbia that have legalized medical cannabis, and 15 states and the District of Columbia that have legalized adult-use recreational cannabis. However, cannabis remains illegal at the federal level, where it is classified as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. The federal government's continued classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug has created a legal and regulatory conflict with state-level cannabis laws. This conflict has created uncertainty for individuals and businesses operating in the cannabis industry, as they are technically in violation of federal law even if they are operating legally under state law. The federal government has the authority to enforce its drug laws in states that have legalized cannabis, but it has generally adopted a policy of non-interference with state-level cannabis programs, particularly for medical cannabis. However, this policy is subject to change depending on the priorities and attitudes of the current administration. There have been ongoing efforts at the federal level to reform cannabis laws, including removing cannabis from the list of Schedule I drugs and allowing for more research into the potential medical benefits of cannabis. However, progress on these efforts has been slow, in part due to political and ideological divisions, as well as concerns about the potential risks and negative consequences of cannabis use. Basically, it doesn't matter what team is in charge. When it's a political chip that they can use to play to the masses, they will use it. And what have the last three administrations done? Okay, so Biden pardoned a bunch of federal prisoners, basically did nothing. I think is a very low amount of people that got out. Glad they're not still in jail. Trump, forget about Trump. He's an idiot. Uh, Obama, Obama still raided a bunch of dispensaries in California. He wasn't very pro-cannabis, so definitely political. Let's keep going. Where does the government get its authority to make cannabis illegal? I think that's a pretty good question. Let's see what it says. In the United States, the federal government's authority to make cannabis illegal comes from the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. The CSA is a federal law that regulates the manufacture, distribution, and possession of certain substances, including cannabis. The CSA was passed by Congress as part of the War on Drugs and was intended to address the growing use of illegal drugs in the United States. The law established 5 different schedules or classifications of drugs based on their potential for abuse, their accepted medical uses, and their potential for dependence. Cannabis was classified as a Schedule I drug under the CSA, which means it is considered to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This classification made it illegal to manufacture, distribute, or possess cannabis at the federal level, even for medicinal purposes. The federal government's authority to regulate drugs and other substances comes from the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. The Supreme Court has upheld the constitutionality of the CSA and the federal government's authority to regulate drugs under the Commerce Clause. However, there have been ongoing debates and legal challenges regarding the federal government's authority to regulate cannabis, particularly in states that have legalized medical or recreational cannabis. Some argue that the federal government's continued classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug is an overreach of its authority and infringes on states' rights to regulate cannabis within their borders. Boom. Let's just take a look at this again real quick. Some argue the federal government's continued classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug is an overreach of its authority and infringes on states' rights. Again, where does it get the authority? Let's continue. So I keep trying to put it in a box, rewording some questions. So, does the federal government have a constitutional right to make cannabis illegal? Let's see what it says. The federal government's authority to regulate drugs and other substances, including cannabis, comes from the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. The Supreme Court has upheld the constitutionality of the Controlled Substances Act, which classifies cannabis as a Schedule I drug and makes it illegal at the federal level. However, there have been ongoing debates and legal challenges regarding the federal government's authority to regulate cannabis, particularly in states that have legalized medical or recreational cannabis. Some argue that the federal government's continued classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug is an overreach of its authority and infringes on states' rights. There have also been legal challenges based on the argument that the federal government's classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug is based on outdated information and a lack of understanding of the potential medical benefits of cannabis. However, the Supreme Court has thus far upheld the federal government's authority to regulate cannabis under the Commerce Clause. Ultimately, the constitutionality of federal cannabis laws is a matter of interpretation and ongoing debate and may continue to be challenged through the courts or through legislative action. Just more continued nonsense. I hope everyone's realizing how ridiculous this all is. Supreme Court, Commerce Clause from 200 years ago, 250 years ago. It just makes zero sense. So let's continue. How can a government under the U.S. Constitution, with the consent of the people, criminalize cannabis? So I'm trying to get it to contradict itself. I'm trying to see if it will pick a side and not just keep kind of dancing around the issue. So let's see what it says. Under the U.S. Constitution, the federal government has the power to criminalize certain activities through the legislative process, subject to the requirements of due process and equal protection under the law. The Constitution provides for a system of checks and balances between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government and ensures that individual rights and freedoms are protected. Really? In the case of cannabis, the federal government has criminalized its possession, use, and distribution through the Controlled Substances Act, which was passed by Congress in 1970. The CSA classifies cannabis as a Schedule I drug, which means it is considered to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. It's contradicting itself now. However, some argue that criminalizing cannabis is a violation of individual rights and an overreach of federal authority. Yes, many states have passed their own laws legalizing cannabis for medical or recreational use despite its federal classification as a Schedule I drug. This has led to ongoing debates and legal challenges regarding the federal government's authority, yada yada. Ultimately, the criminalization of cannabis by the federal government is a matter of public policy and can be changed through the legislative process or through the courts. Changes in public opinion, scientific research, and state-level reforms have led to increasing pressure on the federal government to reconsider its stance on cannabis. Well, we're still waiting. So then I asked it, should the government have the ability to criminalize a plant such as cannabis when it's known to have medicinal uses and has no history of fatal use? I think this is a pretty good question. Let's see what it has to say. This is a question that is subject to debate and opinions can vary. However, from a legal and ethical standpoint, it can be argued that criminalizing the use of cannabis, especially for medicinal purposes, is a violation of individual rights and an overreach of government authority. Boom! Cannabis is shown to have potential medical benefits, including pain relief, reducing inflammation, and managing symptoms of conditions such as epilepsy and multiple sclerosis. Criminalizing its use deprives individuals of access to potentially life-improving treatment and limits research opportunities for scientists to study its potential benefits. Boom again. Furthermore, cannabis use has not been shown to have a significant risk of fatal overdose, unlike many other legal substances such as alcohol and prescription opioids. Criminalizing its use may lead to unnecessary arrests, incarceration, and other negative consequences for individuals, families, and communities. It is worth noting that there are ongoing efforts to change the legal status of cannabis at the federal level, with some lawmakers advocating for its decriminalization or legalization. The debate around the legalization or decriminalization of cannabis remains a complex and multifaceted issue, and ultimately the decision rests with the legislative and judicial branches of government. Right. Government. Okay, so this next one is very telling, and I think its answer says a lot. I think I finally got to a great question here. What can be said of a government that criminalizes and violates individual rights and overreaches its authority? It's a pretty good one. Let's see what Chat GPT has to say. When a government criminalizes a substance or behavior that violates individual rights and overreaches its authority, it can be seen as an infringement on personal freedom and an abuse of government power. Such policies can lead to negative consequences such as unnecessary arrests, imprisonment, and social and economic disparities. Furthermore, when a government criminalizes a substance like cannabis, it may also limit access to potentially life-improving medical treatment and limit opportunities for scientific research. This can hinder progress in the medical and scientific fields and result in missed opportunities for beneficial breakthroughs and discoveries. Ultimately, the government has a responsibility to protect individual rights and promote the health and welfare of its citizens. Policies that criminalize substances or behaviors without a clear justification can undermine these goals and erode public trust in government. It is important for government policies to be carefully considered and evaluated to ensure they are in the best interest of the public and respect individuals' rights and freedoms. Boom. I think that says it all right there. I mean, all right, I've got one more question here, and at this point I'm just kind of messing with it to see what kind of responses I'll get. So, would you say, based on this information, the United States government is acting against its citizens as far as protecting individual rights and promoting health and welfare, as its policies that lead to negative consequences such as arrest and imprisonment? As an AI language model, I cannot make judgments or opinions. Okay. However, it is worth noting that there are differing opinions and ongoing debates regarding the policies surrounding cannabis criminalization in the United States. Some argue that criminalizing cannabis infringes on individual rights and may have negative consequences, while others argue that it's necessary for public safety and upholding the law, even if that law is dumb. Regardless of individual opinions, it is important for the government to carefully consider the potential impacts of its policies and make decisions that are in the best interest of the public while also respecting individual rights and freedoms. The government has a responsibility to promote health and welfare while also upholding the law, and it's crucial for policies to strike a balance between these goals. Let's look at this again real quick. The government has a responsibility to promote health and welfare. Geez, in the last few years, I think it failed at its responsibility to promote health and welfare. So I thought this was an interesting conversation. Maybe I'll have a conversation like this again. If it's something you have some questions, drop them in the comments down below. And been using this Chat GPT a little bit here, trying to come up with some different ideas for questions, as well as I've been using it as a tool to come up with ideas for posts, gardening, stuff like that. So it is what it is. It's not going away. This is the future. AI is here. I guess all we can do is embrace it. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Like, subscribe, share this with a friend, and definitely leave a comment what you thought about some of its answers and responses, and comment down below. Maybe I'll do another episode if we have some more questions for it and see what the responses are. But just kind of points out the ridiculousness of our government and where they supposedly get this authority to criminalize this plant. So that's it for today, everybody. Peace and love, and as always, smoke them if you got them.